Alright, so Final Fantasy XVI just released for PC. A while ago there was a demo, but now it's the full game. And today we'll be testing it with the RTX 4070 Ti Super paired with a 14600K of CPU. That again is paired with 32 gigabytes of DDR5, 6400 megatransfers per second, CL32 memory, 32 gigabytes of it. I'm just going to be running around in this area. There's a fight just past us, but I'll be doing it a little bit differently than previously, just to try and get as many settings in as possible without wasting too much time. Currently we're at 1080p on the Ultra preset, and I've just got the frame rate counter overlay in the middle of the screen so that I can do a little bit of scaling comparisons as well. So as you can see here, the performance of the demo is actually a lot worse than the full game. Just based on the frame time graph, the stuttering, the lows, the full game definitely runs better than the demo used to, right? The demo absolutely ran terrible for me, but this actually is not horrible. I mean, the frame rate is below 100 frames per second on an RTX 4070 Ti Super at 1080p, which is not good, but at least the frame time consistency and the frame time graph is it's pretty smooth, right? So what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be doing resolution scaling, not resolution scaling, sorry, I'm going to be doing preset scaling at 1080p in the specific area. So I'll be just standing here, then we'll drop down to the high preset, then the mid preset, and then the low preset. Then we'll do a little bit of a fight, and then we'll move on to 1440p and then do the same thing, right? So currently 1080p on the Ultra preset, but before we just do a frame rate comparison, I just want to show you something here in the settings. If you go ahead and change the preset, right? So currently it says custom, because if you select a preset, dynamic resolution scaling gets enabled, right? So on the Ultra preset, the moment you disable dynamic resolution scaling, upscaling then is enabled on auto. So just make sure that you disable upscaling and disable dynamic resolution scaling if you want to be able to replicate these results, right? So currently we are getting around I'm just going to not do the lows for now, so around 100 frames per second, right? So let's see what the differences are when we actually drop down the presets. All right, here we are on the high preset, and we went from 100 frames per second to 107 frames per second, so pretty much a 7% boost to our frame rate there. So let's try the mid preset, that's actually what it's called, and then I think we'll just do some DLSS and frame generation scaling, and then we'll move on to 1440p because we are becoming a little bit more CPU bound. Right, so now on the mid preset, we are getting 121 frames per second, so 21% higher than the Ultra preset, and I don't know, maybe 12% higher than the high preset. But you can see our GPU usage is starting to dip. It's close to the low 90s there, so we are, as I said, we're becoming a little bit more CPU bound. I'm just going to drop this down to the low just to see if it scales a little bit further, but I doubt it. And as expected on the low preset, we gained 2 frames per second, right? So really not that big a difference between the mid and the low preset. So I'd probably be playing on the high preset anyway, because we did see a nice boost of around 7% there, and then we'll start testing DLSS as well. All right, so we are back on the Ultra preset, just set with DLSS quality here, and you can see we gained around 34 frames per second compared to native resolution here. Now, I'm not really the biggest fan of upscaling at 1080p, so I'm going to just enable frame generation, and then we'll move on to 1440p. All right, so frame generation took us from 134 frames per second to 227 frames per second. That's actually a very, very big bump to our frame rate just by enabling frame generation. I mean, it's because we are becoming CPU bound, 1080p with DLSS set to quality. So I'm just going to run around a little bit, see what the frame time consistency is like. Just keep an eye on the frame time graph there. Let me start with the lows recording as well, so we can see. I mean, in this small area, I know this is not indicative of real gameplay. It's just to give you an idea what the performance is like. We will do some fighting. So this is with the DLSS set to quality and frame generation enabled. So it runs pretty well. So let's go here and fight a little bit and see what the performance is like. One thing, the cutscenes still drop down to 30 frames per second. It's very jarring, especially if you come from 230 frames per second all the way down to 30 frames per second. It is horrendous, but there is a mod to fix that. I'll link that in the description below for those of you interested, but I'm going to skip the cutscene and just maybe see if I can fight. Right, I've got no idea how to fight in this game. I skipped literally all the tutorial missions here. Just okay, so I can actually shoot magic just to get to this point where I can actually benchmark the game a little bit. And I need to finish within 2 hours because I'm planning on refunding this game. But you can see that even during the small fight we had here, the performance was pretty good. I mean, sure, we had frame generation enabled. As I said, it's just to give you an idea what the performance is like, right? I don't think anybody with the 4070 Ti Super is going to be playing at 1080p, but if you do own a 240 Hz monitor, then these are settings you can use to max out your monitor's refresh rate. Right, let's move on to 1440p, and then we'll just do basically the same thing, right? Right, so yeah, we are at 1440p once again on the Ultra preset, just with the dynamic resolution scaling disabled and upscaling disabled as well. And we are basically just maintaining 60 frames per second here. Not sure if it will drop below 60 frames per second. We'll fast travel to a town just now just to see. I actually thought we would be able to fight these goblins again, but they're not there. But let's do the same thing. Just going to do some preset scaling, and then we'll do some resolution scaling tests, and then I'm going to look for another fight. So if we take away the minimums there, we are sitting with the 68 frames per second here on the Ultra preset at 1440p with no upscaling, no frame generation, no dynamic resolution scaling. I'm going to drop this down to the high preset. Let's see what happens. Right, so the high preset, we went from 67 frames per second to 73 frames per second. Not sure what that is in percentage, but probably around 10%. All right, it was a lot easier to calculate it when the base frame rate was 100 frames per second, but 73 frames per second on the high preset. Right, and then we went from 73 frames per second to 83 frames per second. So 10 frames per second boost to our frame rate there just by dropping to the mid preset. Still not exceptional performance, but once again, the frame time graph is pretty smooth. I know it's it's a very empty area. I'm just using this area to test the scaling, right? So let's drop this down to the low preset, then we'll do some DLSS scaling as well. And then once again on the low preset, I'm not seeing any differences here, right? We're sitting at 83 frames per second. Now we're sitting at 84, 85 frames per second. Now, just one thing that I want to show you here quickly, once again in the systems menu. If we go here, the low preset actually changes the super resolution to legacy TSCMAA plus FSR1. Okay, so I mean, I changed this to DLSS, disable that, and then select DLAA, right? These are actually set to mid, and if we drop this down to low, these are set to low, but it seems like the performance gains from disabling these aren't really that much, or we are maybe CPU bound, although I doubt it because it doesn't look like we're CPU bound. All right, so let's switch this back up to the Ultra preset, and then we'll test the DLSS scaling. All right, so the Ultra preset with DLAA, so native resolution, 68 frames per second. This we knew. And then just enabling DLSS quality, we are gaining quite a lot, right? We went from 68 frames per second to 104 frames per second, which is a pretty hefty boost to our frame rate. This is probably where I'd be playing this game, but I'll enable frame generation as well, maybe on the high preset. Although the VRAM usage is quite low actually for 1440p on the Ultra preset. We're sitting at 6.4 gigabytes of VRAM used, and our normal system memory used is sitting at around 15 gigabytes, 14 gigabytes. So it's not really that heavy. Now I'll just drop this down to DLSS balanced, as I do think balanced is still perfectly fine for 1440p, but that's also as aggressive as I'm comfortable with. I do not like DLSS performance at 1440p, but it's personal preference, right? If you want the higher performance or the higher frame rate, more than welcome to use DLSS performance. It's just to me it starts to look a little bit more pixelated and a little bit more blurry. So DLSS balanced pushed us up to 115 frames per second. So really not that big a difference between DLSS quality and DLSS balanced. So I'll be using the Ultra preset with the DLSS quality, and then we'll test frame generation. Let's see how that goes. All right, but first I just want to see. So we are using DLAA at 1440p on the Ultra preset, and we are getting 120 frames per second with frame generation enabled now. Now I just want to see test the input latency. My input latency is fine. I mean, anything at around 120 frames per second for me personally is fine with frame generation enabled. I do prefer to have DLSS enabled alongside frame generation just to mitigate the input latency a little bit more, because you do get a higher frame rate with the DLSS set to quality, or any upscaling for that matter. And then enabling frame generation, it actually provides a pretty good experience, right? So 120 frames per second here with the DLAA, so and frame generation obviously. So let's see what happens if we enable DLSS quality. So by enabling DLSS quality, we gained another 50 frames per second, and this is actually perfectly fine for me because I do play on a 165 hertz panel. And if I enable VSync and G-Sync and reflex and all that, all the bells and whistles, then my frame rate is actually capped to 158 frames per second, and I believe this should be able to maintain it, right? So let's start capturing the lows again, and I keep on pressing shift to run, but shift is not run. Let's see if we can actually find a fight and see what the performance is like during a fight. But this is actually pretty good. We probably won't maintain 170 frames per second at all times here, but it is definitely worth a shot just to have a look. And I mean, sorry, I'm very new to this game. I've got no idea where I'm supposed to be going, but here we are in some time. Here's a fight. All right, so let's see how it holds up when we actually start fighting. And these tips are kind of annoying. The reason why they're annoying to me is because, like, every time I restart a sequence, the tips keep on popping up, right? But you can see the performance is pretty solid here with these settings. Frame time graph is pretty good, and the frame time graph would be similar even if you don't have frame generation enabled. The frame rate would be lower, obviously, but it's just that it's actually quite good. The frame time pacing, everything is pretty good. It's definitely much better than what the demo was, right? So that's going to be it for 1440p. Let's do some testing at 4K. This game is pretty heavy at 4K, but let's go back to that area. We'll do some 4K testing, and then we'll go to the town and see what's up with that. Right, so here we are at 4K on the Ultra preset, no upscaling, no resolution scaling, no frame generation, and it's looking kind of rough. 36 frames per second here. It's perfectly fine if you are aiming for a 4K 30 frames per second experience, and with the controller, the input latency wouldn't be an issue for you. I'm going to go through the presets a little bit quicker now because, I mean, we do understand, or hope you by now understand exactly what I'm testing here. So we'll go through the presets, then do some DLSS testing as well, and see if we can actually get a high refresh rate experience at 4K, which I kind of skeptical about, but let's see what we can do. All right, so I enabled the high preset, and there's virtually no difference here. All right, let's move on to the mid preset. Right, so the mid preset, we're getting 43 frames per second here. Still a long ways off from 60 frames per second. Doesn't seem like we'll be able to hit 60 frames per second here at native resolution with this GPU. And then the difference once again between the mid and the low preset, really non-existent, right? So, okay, we're not going to hit 60 frames per second here. All right, I think seeing that there's really no difference between the ultra and the high preset, let's just use the high preset for the 4K testing, whereas previously we used the ultra preset, right? Let's see what happens. All right, so on the high preset with the DLSS set to quality, we are getting 63 frames per second here. It won't maintain 63 frames per second. It'll drop below 60 frames per second, especially during fights. So let's see if balanced actually makes a difference here at 4K. All right, so balanced here took us from 63 frames per second to 75 frames per second, which I think is, I mean, it's perfectly fine at 4K, especially if you're aiming for a 4K 60 frames per second experience. Now, I just want to see what happens if we drop down to performance. So DLSS performance at 4K is still acceptable. Personally, I'm still not the biggest fan of DLSS performance at 4K, right? Balanced is once again as pretty much as low as I personally would go, but I do understand that I mean, you want the extra performance, and that's why DLSS performance is there. Now, remember, DLSS performance upscales from 1080p, and we gained another 10 frames per second, give or take, right? I didn't really concentrate. We were getting 78 frames per second, I believe, with DLSS set to balanced, and now we're getting 88 frames per second. So, and there's quite a bit of shimmering now on the floor there. You can just see, like, this is at certain angles there's definitely some shimmering, so that's why I'm not the biggest fan of using very aggressive upscaling even at 4K. Right, so let's drop down back to DLSS quality, where we got around 60-ish frames per second, and let's see what happens if we enable frame generation. Actually, I lied. I switched to DLSS balanced just because DLSS quality does drop below 60 frames per second. Now, for me to enable frame generation, the minimum is a constant 60 frames per second, and DLSS balanced actually gives us that. We were getting around 75 frames per second in that specific spot, right? Obviously, that'll fluctuate as you move along, and I mean, but it's perfectly fine with frame generation enabled. We are almost getting a high refresh rate experience, depending on what you call a high refresh rate experience, right? Personally, to me, anything above 100 frames per second, I'd consider a high refresh rate experience. But I also know that, how am I supposed to do this? I also know that there are 480, 540 hertz panels out there, so it's the range is quite wide. All right. I just wanna get to another place where we can actually fight, and then we'll see what the performance is like, whether it's actually consistent or not. All right, so I found another fight, and still at 4K with DLSS set to balanced. I don't know what I was supposed to be doing. Maybe I should concentrate in the intros and tutorials, right? I'm supposed to dodge, I believe. Okay, right. Like, I'm not really concerned because I do have a lot of health, right? Oh, got it right. So you can see the performance is quite consistent. I know that the performance I'm showing here is with frame generation enabled, right? I'll actually just disable frame generation and drop down back to 1440p with DLSS quality, and let's just see if the performance actually stays more or less the same during a fight. But this is actually pretty good, 113 frames per second. Don't get me wrong, the frame rate could definitely be higher, just considering the visuals. The game is quite demanding for some reason, but the experience is really not that bad. It's a very fluid experience. The frame rate is high enough, the responsiveness is good enough, and definitely no issues of playing this game. If I had to daily a 4K monitor, this is probably where I'd be playing it, right? It's definitely pretty good. Right, I'm just going to see if I can find another spot where we can actually fight some enemies. Then I'll drop it down to DLSS or to 1440p, just DLSS quality with no frame generation, just see what the frame time consistencies are like. Right, so just reset our numbers. We're at 1440p, DLSS set to quality on the Ultra preset, and I do think, as I said, the frame time consistency is pretty good. There's not a lot of stuttering here. There's not a lot of inconsistent frame times. The frame rate is, I mean, it's decent. Now, I know that I don't dislike my video because you're forced to use DLSS to get a good experience. I've seen that quite a few times whenever I talk about gaming performance, and I show that sometimes you have to use DLSS or frame generation to get a playable experience. People dislike my videos. It's not up to me, right? If it was up to me, I'd use DLSS and frame generation as a complementary setting, as it should be, but not as a mandatory setting, right? This is kind of, it is unfortunate that this is what it comes down to. We actually have to use frame generation and DLSS. You don't have to use frame generation, but you have to use upscaling to get a decent-ish frame rate, and that is unfortunate. You can see even with DLSS set to quality, we are dropping. Come on, as I said, these tips. Maybe I should read them. Maybe I'll fight better. But I think I'm going to win. Now, what I was saying that like even with the DLSS set quality, we're dropping below 100 frames per second. Now, that's not an issue per se. It's just that without DLSS, we wouldn't maintain 60 frames per second with these settings, and that's kind of horrible if you consider that this is a 4070 Ti Super. It's the third fastest Nvidia GPU currently on the market, and for it to not be able to maintain 60 frames per second at 1440p, like it is kind of bad. And I just slain my first big boss, I think, right? Actually, I'm I'm considering not refunding the game. The little bit I've played so far is actually quite fun. I did not say that out loud. Should I? Can I just go back? All right. So once again, the cutscenes 30 frames per second. That's horrible. But I think if we can just get past this, I'll fast travel to town. Should I fight this guy again? I'll fast travel to town and just see what the performance is like in town with these exact same settings, right? Because over here we're getting 117, let's call it 120 frames per second. So let's see if I can fast travel to town. And I mean, it differs between, or it varies between 100 to 120 frames per second. Going to fast travel to town, I know I said that a lot, and see what the performance there is like, and then we'll end this video. All right, actually, I am not able to fast travel, so I think that's going to be the end of this video. The town was actually quite disappointing when it comes to performance in the demo, especially. I had quite a lot to say, and people were not really happy with me for what I said when I reviewed the performance of the demo. I must say that I'm really happy to report that the full game's performance is much better than the demo, even in town. Obviously, I needed to get past the town to get to the specific spot, but I can't show you that. I know I'm just running around here, but I hope this video gave you enough of an idea of what the performance is like, and that I've earned a like or a subscribe from you. It'll be greatly appreciated. But on that note, I'm going to say good night. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.